Well, thank you very much for joining us all here today at another London School of Economics Fundación Remorete's online seminar. We've been delighted to be partners with the Foundation from the LSE's side since 2012, so well over a decade now, both with students physically in Madrid and many recipients of scholarships as well who come from the Fundación to the LSE as full-time master's students, and also a series of online seminars we've been running since the pandemic and continue to do that here today as well. This is the second of the 4 seminars this year, and I'm delighted to be addressing major global issues with 2 of our esteemed colleagues from the London School of Economics. Today we'll be looking at what the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists recently, a credible organization who have a rather dramatic version of interpreting global events with their doomsday clock, which said that it is the closest ever to global catastrophe. 90 seconds to midnight being global catastrophe. We're never quite sure what midday means, but we're a long way from that. So there are a number of factors we want to address today, mainly from an international relations perspective. Certainly the war in Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, tensions in the Far East between China and Taiwan, various other trade tensions and economic tensions that are reverberating around the world between economic superpowers and other trading blocs. And as I've said, I'm delighted to have 2 distinguished professors from LSE with us today. Professor Cox was the founding director of LSE Ideas, which is a think tank and always within the top 3 university-affiliated think tanks in the world. It's also a think and do tank, I would say, making our experience around the world and some of the doings we've done together in many parts of the world, which has been a terrific experience of applying LSE's expertise and influence onto policy and the thinking at the highest levels in various countries around the world. Mick was appointed to the chair at LSE in 2002 and had previously held positions at Queen's University Belfast and at Aberystwyth, and he helped establish the Cold War Studies Centre at LSE in 2004 and later co-founded LSE Ideas. He's also lectured to universities worldwide, served as chair of the United States Discussion Group at Chatham House, as a senior fellow at the Nobel Institute in Oslo, and also a visiting professor at the Centre of Defence and Strategic Studies in Canberra, and as chair of the European Consortium for Political Research. Also with us today, and delighted to have you back, Peter, with the Foundation online seminars today, is the Professor of International Relations and Director of the Phelan Centre, the US Centre at LSE, and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. He teaches in the fields of international security and US foreign policy. He also writes and comments frequently on US politics, and before joining LSE, he was Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also held visiting positions at Harvard, at Princeton, at the University of California at San Diego, Universidad de Chile, and CIDE in Mexico City, and the Beijing Foreign Studies University, where he was the William Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer in American Foreign Policy. So thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining the online session today. I thought we would start with a short introduction from both yourselves about the 2 fantastic research centres that you've both founded at LSE, the Phelan US Centre and LSE Ideas, which really bring together a number of international relations specialists, but also more interdisciplinary perspectives sometimes on international affairs. So perhaps, Professor Cox, you could talk to us a little bit about a couple of minutes on LSE Ideas, and Professor Trubowitz on the US Centre after that. Over to you.
Well, first, it's great to be back with all our friends in Spain. I visited there many times with Adam in Madrid, Barcelona, and many other, Zaragoza. So we had a wonderful time, and I look back on that experience with you, Adam, and in Spain with our Spanish colleagues with very great fondness, and I would hope to be coming back very soon. So I'm waiting for that invitation, Adam.
Absolutely.
And from our friends in Madrid as well. So yeah, our ideas we put together back in 2008, as you said. It grew out of a Cold War Studies Centre, but we felt that the Cold War Studies Centre was perceived to be too much about history, which I'm entirely in favour of. You need to know our history to understand the present, but a lot of people saw it like that. We also were getting a lot of demand for other things. And so we broadened it out. We brought in a number of visiting senior professors like Paul Kennedy, Neil Ferguson, and Applebaum, a number of others. we established several programs within ideas, often without very much money to support it, but enthusiasm can take you a very long way. And it continued to grow. In 2011-12, I put together or established an executive master's in strategy and diplomacy, which of course was largely directed at professionals, say more or less in their mid-30s, from all over the world, including, by the way, the People's Republic of China, and even at that stage back then, not now, unfortunately, tragically, from Russia. And so that's how it grew. The three things I think carried it along. I mean, firstly, let's be perfectly honest. Peter and I would be, I think, agreed on this. The LSE name carries. It is to use the term a great brand, but it's a great institution. So the LSE itself was one of the reasons I think our ideas did so well. Secondly, it's in London. That's also very, very important to be at the centre, really, of the world. Even in spite of Brexit, London is still a major metropolitan capital with all the embassies there, and still a lot of money coming into London as well. You may have noticed. I think also we just drew upon the great faculty we got here at the LSE to build programs on Southeast Asia, on China, on Russia, and many other parts of the world. And I think finally what we did, and I'll let Peter make his own statement about his great Phelan Centre, which I think has been a huge success, Peter. So congratulations to you. I think the other thing is we managed to bring in a large number of policymakers. Policymakers who are either still policymakers or are no longer policymakers, actually, I think, want the bridge to universities. And the LSE, I think, is very well placed to establish that kind of relationship with policy practitioners who've come from all walks of life, whether from the economic side, whether from the intelligence side, whether from the military side, and of course, whether from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So I think, in a way, ideas walks on two legs, really. I mean, the academic side and the programs, which are still going along very, very well, but also the practitioner side. I think it's bringing those two sides together, which has been the great success story of LSE ideas, which I hope will continue for another 20 years, Adam.
Thank you very much. Peter, to tell us a bit about the Phelan Centre as well, the US Centre.
Sure. Adam, great to be with you and Mick, and I want to thank you and the Foundation for the kind invitation to participate again in the discussion today. So the Phelan Center is a U.S. center, launched in 2015, and was endowed by the John and Amy Phelan Foundation in 2020. And I think the motivation for it, the idea was that the LSE was in a rather unique position. It had many faculty working on the United States. This only happens at the LSE, who did not actually talk to one another. There was no kind of convening space for the many faculty, whether they were in the economics department or the government department, the international relations department, and so on. International history was also a place where there were many that worked on several who worked on the U.S. So one of the ideas was to create a unit that could bring academics across the LSE together, convened around special events, conferences, public lectures, ideally common research topics and themes. Another thing that struck me very early on and got me very excited about, investing time in developing the center is that everybody who worked on the U.S., nearly everybody at the LSE, did it from a comparative perspective, whether it was comparative foreign policy or comparative legal structure, like comparative federalism. Really kind of across the board. And what was striking about that is someone who spent many years teaching and writing in the United States is that in the United States, you don't think about the U.S. that way. You don't think about the U.S. in comparative and international context. Every other country you think about that way, but not the United States. And so one of the things we did in creating the center was approach the United States in a sense from the outside in, like looking at it from an international perspective and bringing those voices to the table. And I think one of the best things we did was, develop a blog on the United States that at this point has hundreds of people around, academics, policy analysts around the world who blog, who write essays, research-oriented essays on the United States. And it's the only place I know of where you get all of those international perspectives focused on the United States, America's role in the world, what's it going to mean, what's going on with race relations in the United States. Hey, what happened on January 6th? And the focus on all those kinds of issues. The last thing to just simply say, I remember when I took this to the school, because at the LSE, if you come up with an idea, Mick knows this, he had to do it. You have to take it to the academic board, and you have to take it to the school. And at the LSE, the academic board is not a rubber stamp.
No.
So one of the pitches I made, which I really believe, was that, hard as it was to believe, London was underprovided on the United States. Now, I guess you could say this was the good fortune for the center. I'll leave everything else aside. We launched in 2015, shortly before Donald Trump announced his run for the presidency. And and suddenly here was this unit focused, this institution, this center focused on the United States, sitting and being on LSE with LSE's brand behind it. And there was just a tremendous amount of interest and attention in what all of our faculty affiliates, we have over 35, had to say about the United States and where it was headed and what it might mean, not only for the UK, but for Europe and kind of internationally going forward. So it's really been a pleasure and a privilege to be able to lead the center at LSE.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I think absolutely right, Peter. And also during that period of trying to find a source of credible information and analysis that could be relied on as far as possible in that particular era, let's call it. It was short, but it was an era. And that, therefore, with that kind of credible, input and blogging from various academics and people around the world, where people could go for a sort of flight to safety, where they could try and get some credible information that they could use, and there was evidence around the information that was coming out of that, whereas many other sources, as we know, were very different at the time. So I think it's both, gentlemen, congratulations on the creation and continuation of those. So the first question, I think I'd like to start really with the very clear and present issue of the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia and the impact on global international relations. And I've tried to frame it in a way that says that can we really divide those that are very firmly supportive of the Ukraine, both in financially and militarily, and a huge amount of support broadly in the West, and those whose positions is much more supportive of Russia itself, such as China in current circumstances. But there are also a large set of very important countries that have much more nuanced positions or would abstain at the United Nations and so on, such as Saudi Arabia, India, and Pakistan. So I think, firstly, perhaps, Peter, the US foreign policy position on the Russia-Ukraine situation would be somewhere to start. But I'd like to broaden it out also into some of those other countries which are influencing the way in which the war in Ukraine, if we can call it that, is being perceived internationally, and the leadership roles that the US is taking through various institutions, but the US directly itself, and the impact on international relations of that invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Right. Well, Adam, this is a big question, and I'm interested in hearing what Mick has to say. I think maybe what I'll pick up first, I'll tack back on the US, but I think, what does the war mean for kind of global international relations? So maybe to kind of go wide lens first, and then we can, I guess you could say, narrow down to the United States. I mean, look, the war has been tremendously disruptive. But I think the first thing I would like to say is that for all the disruption to the international system that the war has caused in the global supply chains, energy and food prices, increased immigration flows, I think we need to be careful. The war has not fundamentally change the system. Every shock, whether it's 9/11 or 2008, immediately there are all these predictions about everything has changed, nothing will be the same going forward. And there are some things that are threads, or if you will, continuities that are just worth kind of underscoring. One is that I think Western countries have really demonstrated considerable cohesion, consistency, purposefulness in confronting Russia, despite the many economic and social disruptions and dislocations that they've suffered in effect for taking a united stand against Putin's invasion. I think it's also worth underscoring here, it's very easy to lose sight of this, that I think that Putin has suffered a strategic defeat already, kind of geopolitically, but contrary to expectations, the Russian economy and political system have not collapsed under the weight of the West unremitting and unprecedented, really, sanctions. And it's worth pointing out here that Ukraine has defied all expectations by showing just remarkable resilience and true grit in the face of Putin's unrelenting military pressure. I think it's also worth just one other point here before talking about the risks going forward, is that the global economy, despite increased volatility and energy and food and other commodity markets since the invasion, has not slipped into like a deep recession, structural crisis. So I think the bottom line point here is that the international system has been actually a bit more resilient, I think, than many people expected at the outset, than predicted. That said, I think the war has reminded us of the current international order's weaknesses and the global food situation has not gotten better. The world's migration crisis has worsened. And the risk of nuclear war, to go back to the clock that you mentioned at the outset, the risk has only increased, if only because of Putin's repeated threats to go nuclear to prevent a Ukrainian victory in the war. I think relations between the United States and China, which were already rocky before the war, have also worsened as a result of the war, most notably over the question of Taiwan. I think the war has also exposed new pressures in the international system that you alluded to in your question. Most notably, I think the growing influence of states in the global South, and who have I think view the war less as a threat to international stability, the way most Western democracies have kind of framed it. That's the narrative and interpreted it, and have seen it more as an opportunity to stake out independent positions for themselves. And, maybe over the long run, that's a stabilizing influence, but in the short run, I would describe it more as kind of a risk. The war has also, I think, done little, and here I've written about this, and I think the war has really done, despite the unity among Western governments, it's done little to dampen the anti-globalist nationalist passions that are fueling politics in the West. And these domestic pressures are I think, a source of international fragility and vulnerability. And if they haven't exactly intensified in response to the war, they also haven't retreated. And a lot of people expected them to retreat, and they're still there. So while we can, I think, take some comfort in the fact that the war in Ukraine has not triggered, let's say, a new Cold War, I know we're going to talk more about that, or some kind of, I don't know, collective race to the bottom, the international dangers, the risks, and the uncertainties remain considerable. And I think maybe I'll put a pause here and let Mick go, and then if Mick, I don't know if Mick's going to talk about the U.S., we can go back and drill down on the U.S. But I think kind of getting a sense of the landscape is is useful here.
Very useful indeed. Thank you, Peter. Yes, Mick, over to you in terms of that global.
Well, thanks, Peter. Many years ago, I used to teach around a concept called black swans. Do you remember Taleb?
Yeah.
The sociologist, I don't quite know how to define Taleb, but an original thinker nonetheless, although controversial. And his argument about black swans, to sum it up simply, was it's the events we don't predict which have the biggest impact. Yeah. And I suppose in some ways, although I go along with Peter in terms it hasn't changed the fundamentals of the distribution of power in the system, the impact overall, I still think, needs to be taken into consideration. So I would put it, I very much put it in the big black swan box of we didn't predict it, but it's had a huge impact. The other thing I'd say, just by way of defense of the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6, is actually they did predict it. So you know, I'm not saying they got Iraq wrong back in 2002-3 without a doubt, for all sorts of reasons we don't need to go into, but they certainly got this right. And one of the most interesting things, Peter, about the role of the United States before the war was actually going around first to Moscow and then to Beijing, telling them, we know you're going to invade, we know you're going to do it. And of course, the denials came out. And in some ways, I think that gave the intelligence communities in both countries a level of credibility they may well have not possessed before the war itself. Of course, the CIA then went on to say, and here again is miscalculation, Peter, miscalculation, Adam. They then went on to say, by the way, Ukraine would go under in 3 weeks. And that's what Putin believed, and probably what China believed, probably what some in the Ukraine believed, and that didn't happen. So it's the unexpected, which is really quite remarkable about this war, the degree of resistance, the Russian failures, which are ongoing. That doesn't mean to say Russia's defeated. And I think, again, let's be careful. Russia still has a huge military. It's thrown tens of thousands of prisoners and others into the war. A recent BBC report shows that over the last 6 months, the most people have been killed in the war have been prisoners working with Wagner, not full-time soldiers who died more in the first 3 months. So there's a lot of reserves there on the Russian side and a determination by Putin. And we're not at the end of this war yet. I think we can only make a provisional assessment, I think, Adam. This war is going to go on. Putin cannot lose, and the Ukrainians believe that victory is possible. And between that rock and that very hard place, you've got a long, bloody, and possibly even bloodier conflict going forward than we have at the moment, in spite of all the efforts we're seeing now by African states or by China and others to think about peace. But go back to Peter's challenging and I think very interesting and ultimately correct view. It hasn't changed the system. In many ways, I think it's actually confirmed certain things as well about the nature of where we were in 2022. The first thing it's confirmed is that Putin is very aggressive. I mean, if you needed any proof about Putin's foreign policy, if you went back to Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, the Russian role under Putin in Syria, you know, I mean, and, you know, we underestimated Putin, frankly, and we underestimated his determination. And in many ways, therefore, the first thing it's confirmed, I think, Peter, is those of us who had a pretty pessimistic view of where Russia was going under Putin have, unfortunately and tragically, I think, been confirmed. I think the second thing that's been confirmed, Peter, is actually the China-Russia relationship, about which I'm trying to write a book at the moment. I'd always argued that this was a much more powerful relationship than some analysts were saying many years ago. And I think what the war has done, rather than weaken the relationship, has probably reinforced and strengthened it. It's reinforced Russia's dependency on China. And if you go from what Xi says, not what mid-level officials say, Xi is clear. This is a rock-solid relationship with a partner for the long term to change the world order. So it's confirmed that relationship. I think from the US point of view, Peter, as you know, before the invasion, we were living in the shadow cast by the Afghan withdrawal,
right? And
Biden wasn't doing well in Europe, and certainly not even in the UK, where there is supposed to be a special relationship with the US. And I remember that debate in the House of Commons after the withdrawal. It was bitter. It was bitter. Now look where we are now. We're in a very, very different place. And if it's proved anything, and I want to say this rather carefully, if it's proved anything, is that if you're going to have a true European security architecture, you're not going to have it without the US. There's a lot of talk about strategic autonomy. I'm not against Europe doing more. I think many of the ideas that Macron has come up with need to be discussed and debated openly, not just refuted. Nonetheless, if this war has proved anything about it, I know it's a very controversial word. It's used, indispensability. Madeleine Albright used that term many years ago. But, without the US, the Ukraine may not exist at the moment, and NATO's response may not have been, as Peter pointed out, the response it was. 80% of the equipment going into Ukraine is coming from the US, and the Russians know this damn well. That's why they want to stop it going in. Two other things very, very quickly. One other thing, really, because I've gone on for too long. It's also brought out something which Peter hinted at, but I'll just add something to that about the role of the global South in all this. Now, if we look at the votes in the United Nations, the majority of countries in what we used to call the third world, what we now call the global South, neither term am I particularly happy with, but there you go. The vote in the UN basically said that most countries there oppose the invasion. That's what they'd said. So we've got to be careful before we say the whole global South is on the side of Russia. That's just simply not true. But there is an ambiguity. There is an ambiguity. We see this with Lula in Brazil. We can see this with South Africa and the ANC. We can see it in a number of other countries in the global South, like Argentina and even India itself. And so therefore, I think this has been a big wake-up call for the global North. Really, they've got to kind of analyze why it is that some elites and groups, and even popular opinion in sections of the global South, on the street, to use a phrase, has this ambiguity about the war, and in some cases even a pro-Putin line on the war. So I think this is a huge wake-up call for the global North to get its act together, to think about this, and not just dismiss it. So, well, it's just a few radicals on the left or the right. It's got to start thinking why this is happening, and rectify some of the issues which I think have driven this ambiguity on the part of the global South.
I think it's a very good point, Mick, and something we alluded to earlier, or Peter, as you said in your introduction to the Phelan Center, also it's looking at the US from the outside in, and this is not normally or hasn't traditionally been the approach, and where LSE plays a great role in being able to do that comparatively and internationally. Is it fair to extrapolate that point about the global South looking at this between Russia and Ukraine as a kind of outside-in perspective and saying, well, that's a big European issue, it's a global issue, and we sort of need to take sides, but we have other things to do as well, and we're not going to necessarily take a firm position and become aligned with either side as other major global powers are doing? Is that something where the global South, or some of the major economies, let's say, have looked at this as something that is not necessarily where you have to take sides?
Yeah, I think so when I look at those votes that Mick mentioned in the UN, there's a tendency to view this as a kind of uniform, like a block that has formed, and with a fairly coherent and clear strategic agenda. And I don't think that's accurate. At least it's not accurate yet. Perhaps that does develop down the road. but I'm skeptical of that. I think it's hard. It's going to be hard to get India and South Africa and Brazil and on the same page, and they have different strategic issues, different economic places, and different places in the global economy. I mean, just India itself, just geopolitically, has a set of concerns where, in some respects, it will want to align more closely with the United States and has moved over time to tighten its relationship, especially in recent years through things like the Quad, with the United States to get leverage on China, and to deal with the competition there. At the same time, I don't think India wants a fair degree of autonomy in the international economy. Is not going to completely hitch its wagon to the United States, and I think that's just one of many examples where I think it's not exactly that they'll engage in what's sometimes called forum shopping, but they will in effect play the larger powers off of one another, try to improve their own strategic and economic position. And I think that's what that vote really is about, is that they're exercising and voicing greater autonomy, not necessarily as a bloc, but some of them are so significant as players on their own terms, India being the most obvious, but I think this is true of Brazil. South Africa, one thinks about in Nigeria, that they just can't be ignored going forward. And I think to the extent that US-China competition increases and does become global competition, those countries are also going to be they're going to be in a stronger position to play the two sides off of one another.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Thanks, Peter. Great comments. And I agree with you. We've got to be careful not to talk of the global south as a bloc or having a single position. It's much more ambiguous than that. And I agree with Peter. We don't want to overplay that one. And I think it has been overplayed in some of the commentary. The whole global south has gone in behind Putin and behind the wall because they don't, they have their own problems. On the other hand, I'd also add, and I don't think Peter and I would disagree on this, is that both Putin and China together, and they've been playing the same attack team here, if you like, have been very effective, I have to say, more effective than anybody would have suspected, in putting out a line, in putting out a narrative, to use that term, which has been, and they've been very, very active doing it through their embassies, through social media, through all the things that we weren't even keeping an eye on, if you like. And they've been doing it for a long time. And I think they played to three resentments, if I can, apart from the obvious resentment that we are poorer than you in the north, which is a kind of a pretty basic material resentment against you. You guys are wealthy and we are not so wealthy. And one of the reasons we're not wealthy because you used to exploit us in the colonial era. And that is still hanging around on the streets of the Middle East and of South Africa and South America. So I don't think we should ever underestimate it. Even if, like Peter, I agree, we shouldn't treat it all as a block. I think the two other things I'd add very quickly here, don't forget history here. Here we go back to the Cold War. A number of countries in Southern Africa were helped in their liberation struggles by the Soviet Union and to a degree by China. Mm-hmm. And they've got long memories. And also they've got long associations. And you think of the ANC, the African National Congress in South Africa, it was closely aligned for many years under Mandela and others, under the leadership until apartheid was abolished. It was closely aligned to the USSR. It got many of its weapons. It did a lot of its training. It even got part of its own ideology. And although Russia is not the USSR, Putin's been very clever at playing that particular historical link to his advantage, and maybe even getting arms from South Africa. We'll have to wait and see if that is finally. So the legacy of history plays a role here to Russia and China's advantage. I think the 2003 Iraq war has come home to haunt the United States. as we always knew it would, Peter. We were opponents of that war. But one of the things I don't think we fully underestimate is that 20 years later, it would still be used in the narrative about the Ukraine war. And again, is being used quite effectively. The double standards argument. Why do you complain about Russia going into Ukraine when you yourself, employed force to go into Iraq? So I think I go with Peter. It's not a block, and I think we're well aware of that. And as much the West can still do, and much the United States still has to do, in terms of aid, in terms of how it relates to what we call the global South. But nonetheless, I think the levels of resentment on the street are pretty high. And you know the Middle East quite well, Adam. Peter, you know Asia quite well. I kind of know other parts of the world pretty well. And you feel this in any conversation that comes up. Oh, well, look what happened in Iraq in 2003. Oh, by the way, all that structural adjustment you imposed on us, which made us poor, through the IMF. All that is coming home to roost to some degree. So while elites in the UN, have gone in a certain direction, the majority, of course, in the end have opposed the invasion, nonetheless, they've got a public opinion that they have to deal with, and that public opinion can be hugely difficult to deal with if some of that is actually understanding of Putin, and indeed takes the view, and I've heard it expressed so many times, well, Putin only's done what he'd do as a defensive measure because the United States was enlarging NATO. I've heard that time and again in conversations with various people. And by the way, not just in the global South, but also around Europe as well.
No, thank you. Thank you both. I think that actually takes us on to our second topic, where the role of the US-China relations, as you mentioned at the beginning, Peter, have perhaps become more visible, or the strains therein. And some of the areas I wanted to explore today with both of you were partly a legacy from the Trump era, as we said, the foreign economic policy in particular, or economic diplomacy, if you can call it that, undertaken by the Trump administration, and then exacerbated perhaps by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that also leads into the issue where the relations with Taiwan, as you also mentioned, Peter, have become under increasing scrutiny, let's say, or increasing pressure, with a number of high-profile visits to the US by Taiwanese officials and vice versa. And so there are a number of Eastern-related foreign policy issues here that relate back to some of this visibility or impact of not necessarily the war in Ukraine, but other wider issues that we've been encountering. So perhaps, Peter, we could start with you with US-China relations, and perhaps particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, and also the focus on Taiwan at the moment, which has been more present in international relations and the news than it has been previously.
Sure, Adam. So, I mean, there's a lot to say here about US-China relations. I think maybe to try to keep my comments limited, I'm going to limit myself to maybe 2 points. The first is, I think, just so everybody's on the same page, to just understand how much this relationship has deteriorated. I mean, 20 years ago, so Mick and I have both been going to China for some time. 20 years ago, the whole context or premise of a conversation about US-China relations would have been completely different. I mean, back then, our discussion would have focused on the promise of Sino-American relations, not only for the two countries, but for the world more generally. And the prevailing view in policy and academic circles, and I would say this was true of inside China as well as the United States, was that America's and China's commitments to a world of kind of ever freer markets and institutionalized cooperation would deepen, and the bonds between Beijing and Washington would grow stronger. I recently returned from 3 weeks in China, just when they opened up. And I can assure you, I mean, there's no one that I talk to that shares this view at all. And I mean, and many are deeply saddened by the state of relations between the two countries. I mean, the talk of deglobalization, decoupling, de-risking is commonplace, and they use different terms, but they're talking the same thing over there. And really what is unfolding is the process right now, this kind of tit for tat between the two sides, has all the markings of what IR scholars call a security dilemma, where both sides basically just assume the worst about each other's intentions and then just act accordingly. And the second point I think to make here is that the Ukraine war has just simply exacerbated the mistrust and the tensions by effectively strengthening the hands of hardliners on both sides, who see Taiwan in particular as a litmus test of national resolve and credibility. And while I think the likelihood of a premeditated attack by Beijing on Taiwan is like relatively low, it would be very costly, I think, for China economically and potentially militarily. The risk of inadvertent escalation, and war stemming from an accident at sea, or what actually really concerns me is a political misstep by a Chinese or an American leader seeking short-term political gain, really cannot be ruled out at a time when, mistrust in this relationship between these two countries, I think, is at the lowest, the highest level, I guess, if we're talking mistrust, at any time since they began normalizing relations going back to the 1970s. I know there have been moments like after Tiananmen in 1996, over Taiwan, but this is bigger. And, when I talk to Chinese kind of counterparts, people I've known for a very long time will say it'll be 20 years before the two countries are able to kind of dial this, that basically it'll be another generation. And so that the challenge right now is just to manage it so that it doesn't go off the rails. That may be too strong, but I think I think it underscores the fact that how far the relationship has deteriorated. And I would just say one last thing here is the fact that other countries in the region see the jockeying between Beijing and Washington over Taiwan in particular, I think, as a bellwether for each side's larger strategic intentions in the region, only heightens the geopolitical and, I think importantly here, the domestic political stakes in Beijing and Washington for demonstrating resolve. And so, the problem here is you're kind of headed into something that has some of the markings. I would not describe it as a Cold War, but it has some of those features where you don't have the kind of guide rails or guardrails really in place to manage that relationship. And I think the great danger is that we're going to learn the hard way, the way that the US and the Soviets did, through crises, which is not what you want. You want the dialogue now in advance to try to find, the parameters. And I do take some solace. I think it's a very good sign, let's say, that Blinken is going this weekend to Beijing. And I think that those discussions are extremely important. And I would say, I don't know what Mick thinks about this, but just over the last 2 months or so, the tone has begun to change on both sides. And they need a problem that they can work together. And it would be they might, I'm not predicting this, but the place where it could really make a difference is if they came together over Ukraine and the war there and settlement. I'll leave it to Mick.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm not going to be any more pessimistic or optimistic than you. The point you ended on, I think, is still an important one to keep in mind. And Janet Yellen, who of course basically runs the US economy, former LSE, I should also point out, I always point that out, of course. If anybody has an association,
they like that.
I'll mention it.
The directors like that.
I know. We always claim something. Also, the current president of Taiwan as well.
Taiwan also, yes.
Yeah, indeed. So, so look, if one kind of picks up some of the signs that Peter hinted at, coming from Yellen and coming from a number of senior US corporates as well, including Musk, of course, Elon Musk, who made a trip recently to China. But not insignificant, whatever you may think of him. Clearly, the corporate sector in the United States is deeply worried about this deterioration in the relationship for the very obvious reason that China and the United States have become closely integrated. And so, they're deeply worried. And, this is not just a few jobs, this is millions of jobs on both sides of the Pacific. So there is that, which still acts as, let's call it a brake or guardrail, Peter, I think we don't disagree on this, on the relationship dropping off the cliff and descending into that overused term, a new Cold War. And like Peter, I have some doubts about using that. I think it's misleading. It's a nice slogan, but I'm not sure it explains the complexity, because it means basically China is still dependent on the US and the US is still dependent on China. And indeed, if the two fall out, the consequences, not just militarily or conflict, or is there going to be a war over the South China Seas or over Taiwan, the conflict just on the world economy would be a disaster, because these are the two biggest economies in the world. There's a recent article I just read by a person I follow quite closely, Stephen Nudge, and he was saying, well, look, hold on. If there's a conflict, we're all in trouble. It won't just be Taiwan. It won't just, all these guys focusing on guns. Let's just think about the knock-on. So that gives me some hope, at least some space within which we want to judge that relationship. The other source of, if not optimism, at least, and not hope either, but a source of thinking beyond the deeply pessimistic analysis that most people hold to, and I understand why. I think the other thing is that on certain key global issues, there is some agreement between China and the United States, which we need to talk about. If we're going to kind of get climate change in any way resolved, dealt with, or managed in any way without a deal by the two biggest polluters and the two biggest economies, we ain't going to get there. And I think they're well aware of that. Take the question of nuclear proliferation. China has been very tough on the nuclear proliferation question, and I'm pretty certain slapped Putin over the wrist, or slapped him somewhere over the question of his threat of using nuclear weapons. So there are areas, in other words, where we can at least not draw great hope, but at least balance off the debate and balance off the discussion, and hope that these factors also play in to the discussions going on with Secretary of State Blinken and others, because corporates do matter, whether you like them or love them or loathe them, the very fact that they kind of, are the source of our wealth and jobs around the world. Having said that, and I'm now going to go back to my pessimistic mode just for a second, it's very difficult to see many areas where China and the United States really do agree on other fundamentals. They don't agree over Taiwan, zero. Although they may agree that they don't want a war over Taiwan. I think that's also clear. America doesn't want Taiwan to declare independence, which would lead to war, no more than China. So maybe there is, but nonetheless, it is a deep source of conflict. The war in Ukraine, as Peter has hinted, and I've written about this again, it's heightened deep suspicion in Washington about China's intentions. The fact that it has, declared neutrality in the war, but in a sense, been pro-Russia and pro-Putin, been pretty obvious. That has not given much hope for a public opinion, either in the US or indeed within Europe, about China's long-term intentions. And also they disagree about something else, and this is really more fundamental, and it brings us back to our IR days, Peter, and we're still in those days, aren't we? We always had a theory, or some of us had a theory, kind of an old realist theory, if you like, against the liberal theories, is that in essence, the liberals are fine and nice people and write very good books, but nonetheless, they believed that there was a possibility of integrating China into the world order, into the world system. You know, make it a stakeholder, to use the term that was used at the time. And that doesn't look like it's worked. Indeed, realists of the harder variety, people like John Mearsheimer and others, are kind of sitting there thinking, well, this is what I told you so. You know, when rising powers rise, they challenge the status quo. And what Xi is doing in his own way and for his own reasons, both domestic and international, is simply saying, hi, guys, we're here, we're rising, we have the power. We want to overcome forever and ever and ever the century of humiliation. We ain't going to just sit at the table reading from an American script or a Western script. And that, in essence, strikes me as something which we've simply got to take into our analysis of where we think this relationship is going. We could talk about this event, that event, who said what to whom. We can even focus, as number of people have, on Xi himself. Has Xi overreached? You know, has he made a fundamental difference to the conduct of China's foreign policy? Of course he has. Of course he has. But nonetheless, underneath his argument is a kind of more basic one about power and the order that he wants China to live within. And he says it's not going to be a Western-dominated, US-led order. And therefore, we're going to try and seek to change that order or find a much bigger space within that order. And therein, fundamentally, lies the source of the long-term competition between these two countries. Can it be managed? I think it can be. Nobody on Beijing's side or Washington's side wants to see it get out of control. But if it's so tense and they're so lacking in trust on either side, as Peter said, a security dilemma, it can always spill out, and the unexpected can happen. And by the way, wars start not because people want them sometimes, but because inadvertently you walk into one, you sleepwalk into it. And that is not ruled out completely now. And that is what's really changed, I think, in my mind. I wasn't saying this 15 years ago, Peter, but I certainly am thinking it a little bit more now.
I think terrific points, I think, both. And I know we're short of time now, but I wanted to maybe just, again, extrapolate that position out a little bit to look at the broader context of Chinese economic diplomacy, let's call it, if we think about Belt and Road and we think about US commercial influence around the world as well, certainly across Africa, for the Chinese influence or buying up lots of assets and becoming quite a dominant player in many parts of the world as well. Is this certainly in Central Asia, but is this something that we see as, is it a Cold War framework is useful to look at the ways in which large economic powers are then vying for influence through economic means in different parts of the world outside of their own national domain, which we see in different parts of the world? Is that something where not quite proxy wars, but proxy conflicts or proxy influences are being used in different parts of the world that weren't as straightforward or as perhaps as by a polarized state between the US and China? Is that something we've seen? And we have a few minutes left, but if we could have a few comments on that.
Peter?
Sure. Well, I think, Adam, what I would say on this is, I think Nick and I, in different ways, alluded to this. So I do think that there'll be competition between the United States and China over resources to feed a green economy. I mean, that will be the irony, is over critical materials and so forth. So I think that some of that competition is kind of built in, and we can expect it. But I'm very when we use the Cold War framing, the Cold War, was global, it was zero sum, and it was highly ideological. I think I don't really see this as, maybe it ends up taking a truly kind of global form, where but to me, I think it's less likely to take the form of a kind of homogeneizing global us versus them form that the Cold War did. And I say that for just I'm mindful of time, but just a few, maybe just to tick off a couple of reasons. One is, I mean, even within the West, while there's great anxiety about China's strategic ambitions in Eurasia and elsewhere, these anxieties are not shared equally by Western governments. I mean, this was on full display. Well, I happened to be in China by Macron, on his visit when he made his comments about Taiwan, comments that many, I think, other Western leaders share but would not say publicly. Some Western capitals worry more about Beijing's geopolitical ambitions than others. The concerns are greater in Washington than, let's say, they are in Berlin and in Tokyo more than they are in Seoul. Now, and so as a result, you might see some with the U.S. positioning itself vis-a-vis China, but it will not necessarily be bringing everybody else on its side, its allies along on that. And the other thing to just say here too, even within Western countries, one of the things that the nature of the challenge that China poses, I think it's very different. I mean, the Soviet Union was a hardened ideological foe. The fear of communism basically compelled political elites, certainly in the West, to demonstrate that capitalism was every bit as communism's equal and more in terms of offering workers greater economic security, equality, and opportunity. And that critical social dimension of the Cold War, I don't see it here, at least not yet, this kind of rivalry for hearts and minds. And I think even in the global South that this is true. It's missing. And it was present during the Cold War. And I think that makes it much harder, to have for this kind of zero-sum competition to really take hold. I don't know. What do you think, Nick?
Well, I've got three little statements here. Russia is not the USSR, and the USSR went under in 1991, and the Cold War came to an end in 1989. That's my bottom line position. Okay. This is not an ideological conflict in the sense that it was for, actually, since the Russian Revolution. Okay. Putin is not Stalin, nor is he indeed Khrushchev or Brezhnev. He's an old Russian imperialist. He has no Marxism, Leninism left in his soul, if he ever did. Those guys did. Okay. And by the way, Mao Zedong died in 1976. And although Deng Xiaoping and the others call themselves Marxist-Leninists, the way they want to project the power of China is not ideologically through fermenting revolution, but the use of Chinese economic power. And I think that is a huge, huge change. And therefore, it isn't in the sense that lots of books keep calling it a new Cold War. It's not a new Cold War. Having that said, I'd make two very quick points because I know we're coming close to the end. One, it is beginning to take on a systemic quality, this relationship of opposition to each other. China does seem to present itself as a kind of different kind of system, however you define that system, to what exists, say, in the European Union or what exists in the US, Canada, or indeed like countries like Australia. They kind of do see it in systemic terms. And after all, the Communist Party is still running China. So that gives it a systemic quality, which I don't think we should underestimate. The other thing is it could be more problematic than the Cold War. I think we could also take that on board, because China's got a lot of money and it can project its power in ways that the Soviet Union couldn't. So whether the fact that it's much more of an economic power makes the world a safer or a less safe place, the jury's out on that for the moment. I certainly hope it makes it a more safe place. But nonetheless, with all this money at its disposal, its ability to huge amounts of aid, it can have greater and greater influence in large parts of the world, which it's doing through economic means, BRI in Latin America, South African continent. At what point does the United States saying enough is enough is enough is enough? I don't know, but nonetheless, this is going to carry on, and we'll be talking about this. I imagine, Peter, in about a year's time with our friends in Spain and with Adam as well. I hope hopefully might be saying more optimistic things possibly. I don't know.
I hope so. I sincerely hope so, Mick, and I hope we do it in person as well, sitting around a table and continue that that debate and discussion. So we're just out of time, but so one question, if I may, as chair of the session, is to come back to our original proposition, which is to say, if you were members of the board of the Atomic Scientific Committee, and 12 noon is utopia and 12 midnight is nuclear Armageddon, where would you two gentlemen consider the clock is at the moment?
Peter, over to you.
So I'm happy to go first, but what I'm going to say is I would have done what the editors at the board at the Bulletin did, which is to hedge and know that the situation is worse. That's clear, and to signal it, because as you pointed out, Adam, at the outset, they have a great deal of integrity and authority. People pay attention to them, and they don't move that needle or, often. And I think it's important for them in a moment where the world is, where geopolitics is more fraught, the tensions are increasing, and where there's a lot of uncertainty and risk, which I hope we did capture without being completely pessimistic. So I think they made the right call without saying exactly where it should be. It needed to be moved.
I agree entirely with Peter. I think it's right. I mean, we are in a very critical moment. There's no doubt. People are referring to a poly-crisis, not just one crisis. There's an accumulation of problems in the international system, one of which, of course, is the war in Ukraine. The other one we've talked about is US-China. There's climate change, which we've not touched upon, but that in a sense is the deeper existential threat facing us all, and many, many other things besides. So I think they're absolutely right to call it like that. Now, I'm actually in favor of worst case analysis, because if you do worst case analysis, as long as it's based on the empirics, that's fine, because that means you want to try and prevent the worst happening. And by calling it like that, it isn't being alarmist. It is simply bringing a wake-up call to people to kind of think. And therefore, if we're not going to tip over the edge, what do we need to do to make sure that it doesn't? And therefore, it remains in our hands, government's hands and others' hands, to ensure it doesn't tip up to the midnight hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. It's been a real privilege and enormously enjoyable, and I hope our audience, I'm sure, will take away much information from this and further curiosity to investigate their own research into the issues that we discussed today. A very LSE discussion, a fantastically global one, really far-reaching as well. So I'm enormously grateful to both of you, Professor Michael Cox, Professor Peter Trubowitz, for joining us today at the Foundation, and we will see the audience at the next seminar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thanks, Peter. All the best.
Nick, great to see you.
Great to see you. All the best. Bye.
All the best. Thanks, everyone. That was fantastic. Really, really super discussion. Thanks.